When most history books explain the origins of World War II, they begin with a single moment. September 1st, 1939. German troops cross the Polish border. The war begins. Simple, clean, easy to understand. But what if that's not where the story actually starts? Because there's a question hiding behind that moment that almost no one asks. How did a nation that was bankrupt after World War I, a country crippled by reparations, inflation, and political chaos, suddenly become the most powerful military machine in Europe in just a few years? Where did the money come from? Armies need factories. Factories need steel. Steel needs capital. And war on an industrial scale requires something even bigger, a financial system. When you start looking at the years before the war, strange pieces begin to appear. American loans flowing into Germany, industrial partnerships with global corporations, and a hidden financing system that quietly funded rearmament while the world watched. These weren't battlefield decisions, they were economic ones, because the road to World War II wasn't built only by soldiers and dictators. It was built by money. The financial story of World War II begins in 1919 in a palace just outside Paris. The First World War had just ended. Europe was devastated. Nearly 20 million people were dead. Entire economies were shattered, and governments across the continent were desperate to prevent another catastrophe. So the victorious powers gathered at the Palace of Versailles to design the peace. Their goal seemed simple: make Germany pay for the destruction of the war and make sure it could never threaten Europe again. But in trying to secure peace, the Allies created something else. Not just a treaty, a financial system that would reshape Europe for the next 2 decades. At the center of that system was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war. This clause wasn't just symbolic, it provided the legal foundation for massive financial penalties, and those penalties were enormous. In 1921, Germany was ordered to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, roughly $33 billion at the time. For a country already struggling to rebuild after 4 years of total war, the amount was staggering. But the payments were only part of the pressure. Germany had also lost 13% of its territory and 12% of its population. Some of its most productive regions were gone. Nearly half of its iron production disappeared. Large sections of coal-rich land were no longer under German control. So Germany faced an impossible equation. It had to pay enormous debts with fewer people, fewer factories, and fewer natural resources. Some economists immediately warned the system could not work. One of them was John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who had participated in the peace negotiations. Keynes believed the treaty was not just harsh, it was economically dangerous. He famously described the agreement as a Carthaginian peace. In ancient history, Rome completely destroyed its rival city of Carthage. Keynes believed the treaty risked doing something similar to Germany's economy. If the country was pushed too far, recovery might become impossible. And that raised a troubling question. If Germany couldn't realistically pay the reparations, how would the system survive? At first, the problem developed slowly. Germany struggled to meet its payments in coal, timber, and cash. The government borrowed heavily, hoping the situation would stabilize. But by the early 1920s, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Then the crisis escalated. In 1923, after Germany fell behind on deliveries, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's most important industrial region. Coal mines, steel factories, and railways suddenly came under foreign control. The German government responded with a risky strategy: passive resistance. Workers refused to cooperate with the occupation. Strikes spread across the industrial heartland. Factories stopped. Production collapsed. But the government still had to pay those workers, and with tax revenue disappearing, Berlin turned to the only option left. It started printing money. At first, the policy seemed manageable. Then the system broke. The German currency began collapsing at a speed few people had ever seen. Prices doubled in days, then hours. By late 1923, 4.2 trillion German marks were needed to equal $1. Savings vanished. Salaries became worthless. Families carried wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic food. For millions of ordinary Germans, financial stability simply disappeared. And when economic systems collapse, political systems rarely remain stable for long. By the mid-1920s, Germany had become something deeply unstable, a country crushed by debt, shaken by economic trauma, and increasingly vulnerable to political extremes. The Treaty of Versailles had been designed to prevent another war. Instead, it created a financial crisis that demanded a solution. And within a few years, that solution would arrive, not from Europe's governments, but from a very different source: international capital. By 1923, the European financial system was on the edge of collapse. Germany's currency had imploded. Hyperinflation had wiped out savings, industrial production was disrupted, and the reparations system created by the Treaty of Versailles was clearly failing. But the problem didn't stop in Germany. If Germany couldn't pay reparations, France and Britain couldn't repay their war debts to the United States, and suddenly the entire post-war financial structure of Europe was in danger. So a new solution had to be found. And this time, the answer did not come from diplomats. It came from bankers. In 1924, an international committee introduced what became known as the Dawes Plan, named after American banker Charles G. Dawes. On the surface, the plan looked like a simple adjustment to Germany's payment schedule. Reparations were reduced in the short term, giving the German economy room to recover. But the real change was financial. The Dawes Plan opened the door for American capital to flood into Germany. Major Wall Street institutions, led by J.P. Morgan and other investment banks, began organizing large international loans to stabilize the German economy. German bonds were sold to American investors who were eager to profit during the booming years of the 1920s. Money began flowing across the Atlantic. Factories reopened, railways expanded, cities rebuilt infrastructure. German industry, which had nearly collapsed only a year earlier, suddenly had access to fresh capital. Over the next several years, more than $3 billion in foreign loans entered Germany, an enormous sum at the time. At first glance, the system appeared to work perfectly. Germany stabilized its currency and restarted its industries. The chaotic years of hyperinflation faded. Economic growth returned during what many historians later called the Golden Twenties. But beneath the recovery, a strange financial loop had formed. American banks were lending money to Germany. Germany used that borrowed money to pay reparations to Britain and France. And Britain and France used those payments to repay their war debts to the United States. The money was moving in a circle, from America to Germany, back to Western Europe, and finally returning to the United States. For several years, the system appeared stable. Investors earned interest, governments received payments, Germany experienced rapid industrial recovery. But there was a hidden weakness. Germany was not generating enough real economic surplus to sustain these payments on its own. It was borrowing the money to pay the money. And that meant the entire structure depended on one fragile condition. American credit had to keep flowing. As long as Wall Street continued lending, the system functioned, but if the loans ever stopped, the entire financial chain would begin to break. By the late 1920s, policymakers realized the system needed another adjustment. In 1929, a new restructuring agreement called the Dawes Plan attempted to reorganize Germany's long-term reparations payments and extend the timeline. But the underlying dependency remained unchanged. Europe's fragile financial recovery now rested on a single foundation: the continuous flow of American capital. And that meant if something ever disrupted the American financial system, the entire structure holding Europe together could collapse with it. For several years, the system appeared stable. American money flowed into Germany. Factories reopened. Businesses expanded. Employment rose. By the late 1920s, many believed Europe had finally recovered from the chaos of the First World War. But the recovery rested on a fragile foundation. Germany's stability depended on one thing: a constant flow of American loans. And in 1929, that flow suddenly stopped. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed. Banks across the United States began collapsing. Investors panicked, and credit markets froze. American lenders quickly pulled their money back from overseas. And when that happened, the financial system holding Europe together began to break. Loans to Germany dried up almost overnight. Investment disappeared. German banks, already weakened by years of borrowing, began to fail. In 1931, one of the country's largest banks collapsed, triggering a nationwide financial crisis. The economic shock was immediate. Industrial production fell by nearly 40%, factories closed, businesses shut down. Within just a few years, unemployment exploded, rising from about 1.4 million people to more than 6 million. Millions of families suddenly had no income. The government responded with strict austerity policies under Chancellor Heinrich Brüning. Spending was cut, taxes increased, and wages fell as leaders tried to stabilize the economy. Instead, the crisis deepened. For many Germans, the democratic government now seemed incapable of solving the country's problems. And when economic security disappears, political stability rarely survives. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party had received only 2.6% of the vote. It was a fringe movement with little national influence. But the Great Depression changed the political landscape. As unemployment and anger spread, extremist parties gained momentum. By 1932, Nazi support had surged dramatically, transforming the party into one of the most powerful political forces in Germany. The financial collapse had done something profound. It turned economic despair into political radicalization and converted a small extremist movement into a mass political force. By the time Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany was still trapped in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed. Factories stood idle. The government faced enormous financial constraints, and the Treaty of Versailles still restricted open military expansion. Yet within just a few years, Germany's economy appeared to perform an extraordinary turnaround. Unemployment collapsed. Industrial production surged. Massive infrastructure projects appeared across the country. To many Germans, it looked like an economic miracle. But behind that recovery was a financial system few people outside the government fully understood. At the center of it was a man named Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was an experienced banker who had previously helped stabilize Germany's currency during the hyperinflation crisis. In 1933, Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank, and soon after he became Minister of Economics. Schacht faced a difficult problem. Germany wanted to rebuild its military, but openly financing rearmament would violate the Treaty of Versailles and alarm other European powers. At the same time, the government did not have the tax revenue to fund massive military expansion. So Schacht designed a financial workaround. It was called the MEFO bill system. MEFO stood for Metallurgical Forschungsgesellschaft, a company created specifically to issue special promissory notes. These notes worked like a form of temporary money. Instead of paying arms manufacturers directly with government funds, the German state paid them with MEFO bills. Companies could then hold these bills or exchange them with banks for cash, with the promise that the government would repay them later with interest. On paper, the government wasn't spending money. In reality, it was quietly financing a massive expansion of military production. Because these payments were technically issued through a separate company rather than the official government budget, the spending remained largely hidden. To outside observers, Germany appeared to be funding public works projects and industrial development. But much of that industrial activity was actually linked to rearmament. Factories began producing vehicles, weapons, and military equipment at increasing speed. Industrial capacity expanded rapidly, and new infrastructure projects, including highways and construction programs, helped absorb millions of unemployed workers. The economic effects were dramatic. Unemployment fell sharply as factories reopened and new projects created jobs. Industrial output surged. Germany's economy appeared to stabilize and grow faster than many other countries still struggling through the global depression. But the recovery carried a hidden cost. The MEFO system had created a vast amount of deferred government debt. By the late 1930s, billions of marks in promissory notes were circulating through the financial system. The bills would eventually have to be repaid. For the moment, however, the system achieved its goal. Germany had built the foundations of a modern war economy, while keeping much of the true military spending hidden from public view. By the mid-1930s, Germany had solved one part of the problem. Through financial engineering like the MEFO bill system, the government had found a way to fund rearmament. Factories were expanding, workers were returning to jobs, and industrial output was rising again. But money alone does not win wars. Modern warfare requires something else: logistics. Armies need vehicles to move soldiers, transport ammunition, deliver fuel, and carry supplies across vast distances. Without a reliable transport system, even the largest army can quickly grind to a halt. And in the 1930s, one of the most important pieces of that transport system came from an unexpected place: the automobile industry. Before the war, two companies already dominated Germany's vehicle production: Ford and General Motors. Ford operated through its German subsidiary Ford Works, based in Cologne. General Motors controlled Opel, which had become the largest car manufacturer in Germany after GM acquired a majority stake in the company in 1929. Together, these two firms controlled roughly 70% of the German automobile market. At first, their factories produced mostly civilian vehicles, cars, delivery vans, and commercial trucks. But as Germany's rearmament accelerated during the 1930s, those same factories gradually shifted their production. Civilian vehicle plants began producing military trucks and transport vehicles. And those trucks became essential to Germany's military strategy. Unlike the trench warfare of World War I, German planners envisioned a faster style of combat, one that relied on rapid movement, coordinated attacks, and long supply lines. Tanks could break through enemy defenses, but trucks were needed to move infantry, fuel, and equipment behind them. In other words, the speed of the army depended on the speed of its transport network. Factories linked to Ford and GM became an important part of that system. By the late 1930s, thousands of trucks were being produced for military use. These vehicles transported troops, pulled artillery, and carried supplies across Europe as German forces expanded their operations. The relationship between German industry and these international companies was not purely economic. In 1938, Adolf Hitler awarded the Order of the German Eagle, a high decoration given to foreign nationals, to prominent executives connected with these firms, recognizing their role in German industrial development. By the time the Second World War began, a large share of Germany's military trucks were being produced in factories connected to these American-owned companies. The financial systems that rebuilt Germany's economy had created industrial momentum, and that industrial capacity had now become something else: the logistical engine of a modern, mechanized army. By the late 1930s, Germany's military expansion relied on more than factories and trucks. Modern warfare required two other critical systems: information and energy. Without them, even the largest army cannot operate effectively. One of the companies connected to Germany's information infrastructure was IBM. IBM operated in Germany through its subsidiary DEHOMAG, short for Deutsche Hollerith-Maschinengesellschaft. The company specialized in punch card data processing machines, often called Hollerith machines. At the time, these machines represented some of the most advanced information technology available. They could process large amounts of data far faster than manual record-keeping. Governments and businesses used them to manage censuses, payroll systems, logistics, and administrative records. In Germany, these systems became integrated into parts of the state bureaucracy. Punch card machines were used to organize census data, categorize populations, and manage administrative records across different government departments. For a rapidly expanding state system, this type of data processing made large-scale coordination far more efficient. Information was becoming a strategic resource. But modern war also depends on something even more fundamental: fuel. Germany faced a serious problem in this area. Unlike some other major powers, the country had very limited natural oil reserves. Yet tanks, aircraft, and trucks all depended on massive quantities of fuel. Without a solution, large-scale mechanized warfare would be impossible. One answer came through cooperation between Standard Oil of New Jersey and the German chemical giant IG Farben. During the interwar years, the two companies worked on technologies related to synthetic fuel production. These methods allowed fuel to be produced from coal through advanced chemical processes. The transfer of refining techniques and chemical research helped expand Germany's ability to produce aviation fuel and other petroleum substitutes domestically. This capability became strategically important as Germany prepared for war. If mechanized armies required trucks and tanks to move, those machines required enormous amounts of fuel to operate. And fuel required industrial chemistry. By the end of the 1930s, two invisible systems had become essential to Germany's growing war capacity. One managed information, the other supplied energy. Together, data processing and synthetic fuel production formed critical pillars of modern industrial warfare. By 1945, the war that had begun with economic instability and industrial mobilization had left much of Europe in ruins. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure lay in rubble, and across Germany, the industrial network that had powered the Nazi war machine had been systematically targeted by Allied bombing. Factories, rail yards, fuel plants, and manufacturing centers were hit repeatedly in an effort to cripple Germany's ability to fight. But many of those factories were not owned solely by German companies. Some belonged to subsidiaries of foreign corporations, including firms headquartered in the United States. During the interwar years, American companies had invested heavily in German industry. Automotive plants, chemical partnerships, and technology firms had all built operations inside Germany's growing industrial economy. When Allied bombing campaigns destroyed these facilities, the damage did not only affect German industry, it also affected the foreign corporate investments tied to those factories. After the war ended, a complex financial process began. Several American companies sought compensation for war damage suffered by their German subsidiaries. Through legal and financial claims, they argued that facilities linked to their businesses had been destroyed during Allied bombing operations. In some cases, compensation payments were eventually granted through post-war financial settlements. The situation created a striking contradiction. Factories that had operated inside Nazi Germany during the war, sometimes producing vehicles, chemicals, or equipment used by the German military, were now being evaluated as damaged private assets. In the years immediately following the war, the world's attention focused primarily on prosecuting political and military leaders responsible for Nazi crimes. The Nuremberg trials investigated government officials, military commanders, and certain industrial figures. But for most international corporations connected to German industry, the legal consequences were limited. Many companies resumed operations in the post-war global economy with relatively little long-term disruption. This outcome reveals an important structural lesson. Modern war economies rarely exist in isolation. They are built through networks of finance, technology, industrial capacity, and international trade. Capital moves across borders, investments link companies to foreign economies, and industrial systems often outlast the political regimes that once used them. The history of the Second World War is often told as a story of armies and leaders. But behind those events was a far more complex system, a network of money, industry, and global capital that helped shape the economic foundations of modern war. When people remember World War II, they usually remember the battles, the invasion of Poland, the fall of France, the bombing of cities across Europe. History often tells the story through armies, generals, and dramatic moments on the battlefield. But the deeper story begins much earlier. Long before the tanks moved and the bombs fell, a series of economic decisions had already reshaped Europe. The Treaty of Versailles created a financial burden that Germany could not realistically sustain. International loans temporarily stabilized the system, but tied Europe's recovery to American credit. When that credit collapsed in 1929, economic crisis quickly turned into political instability. From there, new financial mechanisms, industrial expansion, and technological infrastructure helped transform a weakened nation into a modern war machine. None of these steps looked like the beginning of a global catastrophe at the time. A treaty designed to enforce peace, loans meant to stabilize an economy, industrial investments that created jobs and profits. Each decision appeared rational on its own, but together they built a fragile system that could not withstand economic shock. And when the system finally broke, the consequences were catastrophic. The lesson is not that war is inevitable. It is that large conflicts are rarely sudden. They are built slowly through financial systems, industrial networks, and political choices that accumulate over time.